I want to give you a quick screencast on how to use the Eclipse debugger to help you find your problem in your Java code. So I have my test class here that tests my doubly linked list. I create it, test the constructor. I then add an item at the beginning. I then add a second item at the end, and then I add a third item, and then I remove two of them. So let's run this code. Run as Java application. And I get a null pointer exception. Fantastic. Actually, that's great because now I can start figuring out where the problem is. So the problem, if I click on the My Linked List test, line 30, so I have a null pointer when I do the add, the second add. This is the second add. And so I can click the next one. So this is where the add method is adding at the end. We add its size. That looks good. So let's look at the add at the index. So we're adding at before. So let's go look at add before. And so we get our null pointer here at add before. So it looks like we're having a problem with node previous might be null, because everything else looks like if next is null, that's not a problem, because we're doing assignment, we're doing node this could be, but if this is null, then this will cause a null pointer exception. So this looks like node previous has got a null and it's not correctly set up. So let's go back to our test. So that means that this method is creating a node whose previous pointer is likely to be null. So let's take a look and use the debugger. So we're going to add a breakpoint by double clicking in the margin, and we're going to run the debugger by either right mouse clicking and then debug as, or we can click the little debug button up here because we just ran it. And so now we're debugging, and I've told Eclipse to switch into the debugging mode. You can see that it's in debugging mode, and the program is stopped at our breakpoint. We can see that the thread is stopped. A bunch of controls for our debugger up here. We can continue running, we can stop the program, we can step into the method, we can step over the method. We also have, over here we have a list of the variables that are currently defined. So we have the args, which is an empty array, we don't use it, and we have D, which is our linked list. So now let's step into this method. So we click on the little arrow with the step in, or we hit F5. And so this double thing, well, that's because we have to convert the number 2.0 into the class double. So this is the Java class double, which is converting a little d double into a capital D instance double. So let's step over and step in again. So now we're in the add at index e data, and you can see that the index value is 0, and the data is a double whose value is 2.0. That's fantastic. So we can step into the check index, but that wasn't the problem, so let's step over that. So if index equals 0, which it is, we'll go into the if statement. So now we want to step into this add first, because that's the rest of the else isn't going to be executed. So this is where we're setting up our first node, or the node at the beginning of the list. It's not necessarily just our first node, it's adding at head. So let's step in. So we want to create a new node whose next pointer is head and whose previous pointer is tail. That seems right, except for if we take a look at this, head is null because we have an empty list, and tail is null. So these values are not quite correct, but we'll see what happens. So we step over it. If head is not null, head is null, so we're not going to do that if statement. Else, head equals node, which is correct. Tail equals node. Now tail's not going to be null at this point because we just pointed it to node, so that's probably not a good, well, it's interesting. I'm not sure the logic on this. We have to sort of take a look at this. Else So tail is now pointing something, so we say tail.next equals node. Well, tail is pointing to our node, ID 41, and so we're going to set up nodes. See, next is null, then previous is null. After this, the next is changed to point to ID 41, but previous is still null. And that was what was causing our null pointer exception when we try to add. The next add is because this node's previous is null, so when we said node.previous.next, well, you get a null pointer exception. So it looks like we need to fix the node's previous to point to tail. It's someplace in here, because we don't set up nodes right at this point. These are both null, so we have this sort of special case that tail is not initialized, and then finally we do initialize tail here, and maybe we should make sure that we initialize tail in here or somewhere, or excuse me, initialize node previous to point to itself. Because basically if size is 0, we're adding a node, and tail and head need to point to the node, and the node's next needs to point to itself, and its previous needs to point to itself. So we might want to change the logic in here a little bit to add an if statement on size instead of just checking to see if tail is null. So this logic looks a little flaky to me. We probably want to redo it. And that would solve the first of the null pointers. I don't know if this solves all the null pointers in my code, but it's a good way of, you run the code, we'll just continue on, you run the code, and then you get the null, if you get a null pointer, you backtrace through the code, and then you can find out where the methods are that are causing your problems, and you can use a debugger to actually look at what the values are, what is null, and then figure out why is that null if it's not supposed to be null, or why has it got the wrong value. I hope this helps you give an idea of how to use the Eclipse debugger to help you find bugs in your code and actually figure out where to fix them. Thank you.